Hello and welcome to Clay to Canopy, the show where I attempt to make just about everything from the ground up. In today's tutorial, I am going to be walking you through how to make this cat mat. I totally came across making these cat mats by complete accident. I was looking for a way to get back into quilting and I looked up this idea of rag quilting. I went to the fabric store and bought a whole bunch of fabric, began making this thing, and quickly realized that this was going to take a lot more time than I thought it was going to. I was a little more ambitious for my own good. I ended up doing this square, nowhere near the size I wanted it to be for a throw. I got frustrated because I was working on some other things that needed to move on. So I threw a border on it and threw it on my floor, and lo and behold, my cat went nuts for it. He rolled all over it and it became his mat. And then the other babies decided to fight over the mats, and so I had to make another one. They love the softness and the texture of the ragging part. You throw a little bit of catnip on the center of it and they go nuts. We have hardwood floors here, so we put them down in the winter time. I'm sure dogs would love these also. This is a very easy process if you are a beginning quilter or even a beginning sewer and want to take on something where you don't have to worry too much about seams. It's an incredibly forgiving process. The salvage of the seams become your positive. Taking on something this small in size is very manageable. And at the end of the day, if you mess up along the way, who cares? I don't think your dog or cat is going to complain about what it looks like. I'm sure they'll love it just the same. So here we go. Let's go through the steps of this tutorial. So to start this off, I first cut 25 6x6 fleece squares, and I'm going to be cutting 25 of my patterned cotton. The patterned cotton I'm cutting at 5x5 because I don't need as much of a seam allowance. The whole point of the rag quilting is to have the excess become part of the seam line, so you're going to be cutting up your salvage and letting that be part of the ragging process. But I found that when you rag the cotton, it isn't all that great. It kind of does this weird fraying thing, and by the time you've washed the item several times, the cotton part of it actually disappears and gets disintegrated in the washing machine, so basically it's pointless. So I'm only giving myself a 1/2 inch allowance on the cotton because these are going to end up becoming 4x4 squares. And so I want the excess though to stay large, and I will have a 1 inch ragging on the fleece part of this. To cut my fleece, I just used a rotary cutter and my cutting mat here. It's pretty straightforward. If you've never used a rotary cutter, you just need a cutting mat, which is what I have it on here. And this cutting mat is self-healing, so as I make my cuts, it slowly kind of heals itself. Basically, a rotary cutter is just a rounded blade that spins around and around as you're cutting. So I'm just gonna line up my fabric on one of these edges, and then I will make a clean cut just to make sure I have a clean edge. Whenever I'm cutting on this mat, and this mat was an inherited mat, it already had multiple cuts in it, so to prolong my cutting, I try not to keep cutting on the same whole numbers. I vary where I'm going, so I'm just starting on this 11 and 29 line, and I'm just gonna cut, get something clean, and then count 5 inches. And this is just a clear straight edge ruler. I really love working with this because I can still see what's underneath it, but you could use any kind of straight edge. And then what you do is you position your rotary cutter up against the edge of that ruler, and just putting down a little bit pressure, the wheel will roll as you go. Follow the edge, and it does the cut. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can of course go ahead and hand cut your squares. So I'm going to go ahead and continue my cuts. I need to make 25 total, and then we can get sewing. So after all my pieces were cut, I went and laid out a pattern, something that looks slightly appealing, and then I just wanted to make sure I didn't have ones that repeated next to each other. I'm gonna take a photograph of this because I'll be stacking them, and in case they get mixed up, I'll have the photograph as my reference point. I'm just gonna stack these in a row this way. Alright, I'm gonna take the first row, just gonna eyeball where I think the center is, pop in a couple pins. I am going to do my quilted top stitch to lock this in place first before I bother seaming anything together. So basically I'm going to come in and I'm just going to be stitching X's with my machine across all of these. I'm just going to take the first stack and just pin the first stack. Alright, here we go. I'm just going to put in an X, and I don't want to go from that corner because I'm going to leave a seam allowance for when I stitch this to the other piece. So I'm just going to eyeball skip in there. You don't have to do an X. You can do a crazy design here, whatever you want to do. X's just are easier. So basically, this is what's going to become the quilted top pattern, what you would normally do at the end, but I found that it is much easier to do them on these small squares before I piece the whole thing together, rather than having a bulky piece that's rolling underneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this to all of those pieces. Okay, so I put an X on all of them, and then this is the bottom row, and they need to get joined this way now. I've already attached these two, but I'm grouping them together two at a time. And I'm going to do these next two next. So what I want to do is I want to take them at the right sides and face the right sides together at the seam and pin this down. This is completely opposite for what you would do if you were making a real quilt and not paying attention to the seams. That's what's kind of great about this particular process, because the salvage edge is actually part of the aesthetic of this piece. So I don't care about any of these seam lines. It doesn't have to be perfect because you're cutting up the salvage to create the ragging, and therefore you're actually stitching on the right side rather than stitching on the wrong side like you would normally do with a regular quilt. I'm going to make a stitch here, but I'm going to be using the edge of my patterned fabric as a guide. So I'm going to make sure that my foot sits just right here on the outside edge of this pattern as I make my seam line, and I will only be stitching up to this edge here. So basically the tips of the X from end to end. Alright, now that I have this stitched, I'm going to pull my pins, grab my scissors. I'm going to first get rid of my little pieces of extra thread, and then before I go attaching it to that, I'm actually going to start doing a bit of my ragging early to make it a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and start snipping, but I want to make sure that I leave some space where my seam line is. So I'm going to come in here, and you're going to cut close to the line, but don't cut over the line. I'm going to do about 1/4 inch slices. You can buy ragging scissors. I actually have a pair of ragging scissors somewhere. They're spring loaded so that they automatically pop open to save your hand. So if you decide you really like this process, you're going to make a bunch of these things, then you can buy those scissors. Alrighty, now I'm going to move on to joining the next one, and I think I'll go with this smaller piece first. You can see how imperfect this is, and I kind of messed up this seam on the back side, but here's the thing, it's for the cat, so who cares. When I go back in and I will run this stitch just to complete it, it looks like I started a little too late, so I will come in and fix up that seam and then do my snipping. If you doubt your stitches and you want to give this a little extra strength before you do your snipping, you could actually do a double stitch. Go back in and give this an extra stitch in here to help strengthen it. I'm going to forgo that. They seem to be doing okay with what these are, and this is actually just me using up some scrap fabric. I'll get lots of use out of this before I need to worry about those seams going. Alright, on to this next one. Can be a little bit cumbersome doing this with fleece, but fleece is really what gives it that softness that the cats really love when they sit on it. Yeah, and fleece is what you're using for rag quilting because it doesn't have that frayed edges. It's not going to run and bits are not going to pull because it is fleece. Sure that I know which end is the correct one. I'm going to take a look at my picture. Okay, and this is going the right way, which means that this is my bottom edge. and that these two would be my sides, I'm going to run a stitch from here down and then here in a giant U. Just putting in a lock stitch at each intersection here. Whenever you're repositioning your needle or you have continuing a stitch in a different direction, you can just lift your foot and twist and manipulate your fabric if you're doing curves, or if you're doing what I'm doing where I'm making a box. But make sure that your needle is inserted in the fabric first. Here, I'll continue that stitch. I think I need at least one more. So I'm going to make sure that my needle is fully inserted before I lift the foot and then twist. That way I don't lose positioning and I don't get any extra thread kind of kicking up. Alright, and you know what, I think for the time being I'm not going to fray this bottom edge just quite yet. I'll leave that till the end, but now it's time to start my next row, and I'm going to do the next row exactly as I did this first one, except for doing that excess stitching at the bottom edge. So I'm going to lay these out, and then I will go and stitch two at a time, add the third one, and then the middle, and then it's ready to attach this top stack. I just wanted to point out that after you do your pinning, what you want to do is double check the back side to make sure that you haven't messed up this bit here. Sometimes you can pick it up with a needle and this gets scrunched, so just after you've pinned one side, make sure you check the back of where your seam is to make sure that you don't have something that's messed up. Okay, so I have two of my rows and I'm ready to join them together. I did want to just point out that I am staying about 1/4 of an inch away from my seam line when I'm doing the ragging thing. You know, it's pretty close to that seam line, but I don't want to risk cutting through my seam. I'm going to go ahead and stack these two and pin them so I can basically do exactly what I did here in the bottom, but do that to this seam to join them together. Remember to lock your stitch by throwing it in reverse a couple times. Alright, so I'm going to keep going, creating my rows. So I just wanted to attempt doing this line without having done the shag first, this whole block, and I haven't connected the two, but this was really cumbersome going under my sewing machine because I did not pre-shag these pieces before doing this line. Because this wasn't shagged, this was really thick to go under my machine, and I had a bit of a struggle. And I have a Viking. She's a beast of a machine. I stand by my original thought process of making sure that as you complete each one of the strips to pre-shag in between before you go attaching them together. My next move is going to be putting in this seam line. See how my seam line that I put around the bordered edges up against this side, and then I will do the same here. And I'm doing this in pieces because anything I can do in these small parts just makes it a lot easier under the sewing machine rather than dealing with a large piece of material. In addition to that, I am also going to do my last row and attach it to the small part of 3. It'll be much easier to attach it to 2 of them and then attach the whole thing together. You think I could finish it before you decide to lay on it, huh? I don't know. Oh, okay, but it's not even ready yet. It's not ready yet, Ma. How you doing? I guess I'm done working on it for now until you've done having your nap. Okay. This one gonna be yours? Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and attach this back edge, the top edge, to the two pieces here first, and then I will be attaching the center, and then it's just finish up my ragging and it's done. And it's done. Now the real magic happens with these after a couple cycles in the washing machine when the rag really gets nice and fluffy. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, share with your friends, and I hope to see you back here soon.